Hey everyone, how's it going? So this is my PHP tutorial. The first thing that I want to say is a disclaimer, just to let you all know this is not going to be a normal tutorial per se. I am planning to build and show you how to build a crypto bot for trading. So, it'll trade cryptocurrencies using an API, probably Coinbase. Could be something else though. And I'm also planning to show you how to create a backend API using PHP and a PHP framework. The goal of this tutorial and the two that are going to be following it is to get you from knowing no PHP and possibly no code at all. I'm making it beginner friendly, point where you can follow along those tutorials and you're going to understand what I'm doing and you can build it with me, and then you can break off on your own and expand upon the crypto bot and expand upon the API, and you should have all the tools that you need to do that. So I'm going to be ignoring some things like front-end templating. I'm not going to touch any of the HTML. I'm also going to be ignoring some things in PHP that aren't really necessary for building on the back end. The reason for this is because I want it to be beginner friendly and I want to be able to get you to that point where you can build this cool stuff, but I also don't want to take forever, right? I don't want to upload a 13-hour video. I'm planning to do 3 videos in total. This first one will probably be a little less, and the other 2 might be a little more, so roughly 3 hours in total. And you might have to watch it once or twice, but if you follow along with the projects, you should be able to break off on your own after and build some of your own really cool backend PHP apps. So if that sounds interesting, stick around and subscribe to see when the other videos come out. One thing I should mention is that I'm not going to show you how to install and download PHP in this video and get it all set up. But if you need that and you're running Windows 10, there's going to be a link in the description to a video I recently made, which does show you how to do all those things, and it'll get you all ready for this video. So if you need that, watch this video beforehand and get it all set up. Alright, so getting started here, the first thing that you want to do is open up your folder in your text editor. I use and recommend Visual Studio Code, but it's not needed. You can use whatever text editor you prefer. Inside of this folder, create a new file and call it index.php. The first thing that I should mention is that PHP comes with a built-in templating engine for HTML. Now, we're not going to be doing any HTML in this video, but you have to know this because in order to write PHP code at the very top, you have to put a less than sign, a question mark, and then PHP. Now everything inside of this can be PHP code, and if you wanted to close it off, you could do a question mark and then a greater than sign. Everything outside of this block is going to be rendered as just regular HTML, and we don't want that. So be sure to start with this less than question mark PHP. Alright, so inside of this, the first thing I'm going to do is you're going to see me type these 2 forward slashes, and I'm going to write variables. Now these 2 forward slashes are what's known as a comment. Essentially everything written after this on this line won't be picked up at all when I run this code. This is just for us so that we can read the code and it's easier to read and easier to understand. And I'll probably be using it a lot throughout this video since it is a tutorial. Alright, so what is a variable? A variable is essentially you are storing something to a word or a variable. So let's say I wanted to make a variable called Mike and it was equal to, let's say, 2. The code would remember it for the rest of the runtime that Mike was equal to 2 unless I changed it. However, this is not how you actually make a variable. If you wanted to make a variable, you would first put a $sign and then the name of the variable. So let's call this integer, and let's set it equal to 2. Now I'm naming it integer because it's equal to something which is known as a type of integer. There's several different types of variables. I'm going to go through a few of the more common simple ones right now and some of them later in the video. That was an integer. The next is a string. A string can be thought of as a word, a sentence, whatever you want. It is essentially from one quotation mark to another, it takes everything in there. It can take numbers in there, it can take a paragraph in there, it could take a whole essay if you really want to. So we're going to say my string, and we're going to set that equal to this is a test string. And every line of PHP code should end with a semicolon. The code will not run properly. If you don't do that, you'll get an error. The next one we're going to do is a float. So let's say my float. And again, you can name these whatever you want. I'm just trying to put the word float or integer or whatever in there so that it's more clear what type of variable it is. We're going to set that equal to 2.10. A float is essentially just a number that has a decimal. An integer does not have a decimal. Lastly, booleans. So let's say my boolean, and we'll set that equal to true. Booleans are very simple. They're either true or they're false, and that's all they can be. Now, let's see how we read code in the terminal here. What you want to do in PHP is something called echo. So you type echo with a space, and then you're going to type what you want to display. So for a test, I'm just going to say my test, and then I'm going to close it. Now what we can do is we can open up our terminal, and we can type php index.php and run it, and we should get my test. If you don't and you get an error, let me know if you have any trouble with it. But if your code looks the exact same as this, and you make sure that the directory you're in is the correct one, which for me is this tutorial 1, then you shouldn't be getting any issues. One other thing you can check is you can type php-v and just make sure that you have PHP installed. If that doesn't come up, that means you don't have it installed, and you're going to have to watch the video and figure out how to do that, but it's not that hard. So now that we've echoed my test, let's try echoing a variable to give you a better sense of what variables are. Let's echo integer, and here, because we're echoing this, we should be getting 2. Perfect. Now, if we were to echo my string, we get this is a test string, because that's the sentence that we put inside of our string. If we were to change it and say this is my test, this time it'll say this is my test. And that's essentially what a variable is. It's just temporarily storing whatever we want it to store, and then we can use that for whatever we need it for. It's very helpful, and you cannot make a program without them. One last thing I should note is that all these variables can be changed. So you'll see how this says this is my test. If I say my string and then equals, I can change its value to not my test. And then if I run it, we get not my test. Now, a key thing to not get confused on here is if I put this whole line of code below the echo of my string and I run it, we still get this as my test, which might seem confusing because we have not my test, we have it changed. However, it should be noted that generally speaking, the code is read from top to bottom. So here it sees that it's set to this is my test, and then it sees that we want to print it, and it actually prints it before we change it. And that's why it doesn't come up as that. As you saw before, if this was before us echoing it out, we would get our new string. So that's something to keep in mind. Try not to get too confused about it. I know it confused me a little bit when I first started programming, but it'll make sense as you go along. The last variable type that I want to talk about is arrays. So I'm going to remove this for now, and I'm going to make a new variable. I'm going to call it my array. There's two ways to write arrays. You can either use these brackets, or you can type array with a parenthesis, like that. I'm going to use the brackets, so I'm going to say equals bracket, but you might see me use the other one at some point too. That's totally fine. Now what an array is it's essentially a variable that can store multiple variables. It's very handy and you'll be using it a lot. So let's say I want to store a bunch of numbers. I could say 1, comma, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 9, 10, 11, 19, or 189, whatever. It doesn't really matter what we put in there. And the cool thing is that this is now storing all of this. Now, you can't echo out an array and you can't echo out objects, which we'll get to at the end of this video, but instead of echoing those out when you want to see them, what you have to type is var underscore dump, and then inside of parentheses, you're going to put the array. So I'm going to say my array. Now, the reason you can't echo it out is because there's so many, it just doesn't really compute right. But if we var dump it, you'll see it tells us that it's an array, and it tells us, at index 0, the first thing that's in there, we have a 1. The second thing that's in there is a 2. And I know it's a bit confusing because it doesn't start with 1, but in all programming languages, at least all the ones I've learned, arrays start at a 0 index. So you're going to have to just think of 0 as 1, and 1 is 2, and 2 is 3, and so on. And then at the end we have 10, even though there's 11 numbers. I know that might seem a bit confusing, but it's more just repetition. You'll get used to it. Alright, now that we've done this array, we can get rid of this. And we can start working on functions. There's two key parts to functions: the function declaration, and then the calling of the function. For the declaration, it's pretty simple. You use a function keyword, and then you type what you want it to be called. I'm going to name mine my function, but you can name it whatever you want. You put a pair of parentheses, and then a pair of curly brackets. And inside here, you type whatever you want in your function. I'm just going to type echo function ran. Now if I run this code, you'll see it doesn't get echoed. That's because this function's never called. A function has to be called, or else the code inside it is never read and it's totally ignored. So what we can do here is just call the function, which is just done by saying my function, and then parentheses, just like that. And there you go. Now the function has been ran. Something else that's interesting is a function can take in a set of parameters. So here, let's give it the parameter message, and then let's echo out the message. And if we run it, we're going to get an error because we didn't pass anything to it. So let's pass it my message, and there you go. The message is now being printed out. And this is really the beauty of functions. If you have a segment of code that, let's say you want to run like 20, 30 lines of code, 3 or 4 different times within a program, you would want to put in a function, because you don't want to copy and paste those same 30 lines and just change the variables. This way you can just pass it variables and it'll do whatever you want with those variables, and then when it's done, I could call it again and pass something different. You'll see it looks a little funny because I didn't put a space, but I can fix that too if I want to. And there you go. And that's really functions. If you wanted to pass multiple ones, let's also pass a number. So we could pass, 2, maybe 10, and then we could echo them both out. Now, one thing I should mention here is concatenating a string and an echo message. If you want to echo out more than one thing, what you can do is you can use periods to concatenate it. So we could say a period, and then we could put a space here, and then another period, and then we could put the number. And now if we run it, you'll see we do my message, a space, the number, my second message, a space, the number. That's exactly what we want. Another way to do this in PHP is, instead of concatenating, if you're using double quotes instead of singles, you can use either one. You can just leave it like that, because inside of double quotes, it can read a variable. You'll see I usually concatenate, but you can do it either way. Something else that I want to be sure to mention here is if we were to, for a minute, comment this out and change this to test equals. So here we're creating a variable called test. And then let's just echo out test. Now we're setting it equal to a function, but right now that means nothing. What we have to do is, instead of echoing this, we're going to return this string. And you can return a string, an array, any kind of a variable. And basically what returning means is that this function, it can run everything, right? So we could run whatever we want in the function. But once we put return, the function will end. So nothing after that will be ran. If I write echo hello, that'll be ignored. And if I don't put anything, it'll just end the function. But if I put a variable after it, here I'm putting a string, which also has two other variables in it, that might be a little confusing. So let's just return the message. Now let's run. And you'll see we get the message, because test now equals that message. Going back to what I had before, if I run it, we get my message and 2, because it's all just one string now. And that's because we're returning it and we're setting test equal. All right, now that we're all set with the functions, we can get rid of it. So let's comment it out. I'm gonna just hold Control and press the quote and question mark button at the same time once I highlight it all. That's a little shortcode in Visual Studio Code if that's what you're using, or else you can individually comment out all the lines. Going back to arrays and strings again, I'd like to mention that there are a plethora of functions, so many functions, that are built into PHP that can work with strings and arrays. And the way you could use it could be something like, let's just echo one out. That'll return a value. Let's do string len, which is going to get the length of a string, and then we can give it my string, and then we can run it, and we get 15 here. Now the reason we get 15 is because there's 15 characters here, so it's giving us that length. And I'm not going to be able to go over each one because there are so many, but I'll leave some good resources. As you can see, there's a lot, and that's just for strings. There's also a whole bunch for arrays, but W3 Schools is a great resource for beginners, and I will leave this in the description. If you ever are doing something and you're going, how do I, what if I want to grab every, I don't know, even number from an array or something like that, or what if I want to grab everything in a string from the first character to, where it says Y? Well, that's where you'd want to use those functions, and you'd want to go through that list and read the description and see which one matches your needs. Now that we've covered this, let's delete it. And let's get into arrays and looping and indexing. Now I know we already created an array, but what I'm going to show you now is how to access individual variables inside the array. Like I said before, each one has an index, starting with 0 and going all the way up to 1 minus the actual amount of numbers. So, if there were 20, the last one would be 19. If there were 50, the last one would be 49, so on and so forth. So to show you what I mean, what we can do is we can type the array that we want, the same brackets we used to declare it, and then put an index inside of it. So let's echo this out, and we should get 1, which makes sense because we're getting the 0 index, which is, let's say I wanted to grab the 11th index, this big number, I would put a 10, and then run that. And there you go. You get 189. Put a random one in here too. Let's put 5, see what we get. We get 6. So that is number 5. That's the 6th index. Hopefully that makes sense. Now what I'm going to show you is how to loop through an array. And for all this code too, if you want to keep it, you could always just comment it out if you want to reference it later. I'm just going to delete stuff like this. So we're going to do a for loop here. And you know what, you might not have the quick hand, so I'm going to just type it all out here and explain it as I go. So for parentheses, then you're going to say $i, which is going to be the index. Set that equal to 0. You could set it equal to something else for a different loop, but for here we're going to do 0. And then we're going to say I is less than, and then we can say count, which is a function, and then we can say myArray. And basically what count is, as you can see, is it's going to return all of the elements, well, it's going to return the number of elements in the array, the length essentially. So this is what I mentioned before about how there's a lot of built-in functions in PHP. I could just put a static 11, but this is better because it makes it more dynamic. So you could type the same code every time. Or maybe I want to go back and I want to add 3 more to this array, or maybe I'm dynamically pulling this array in from somewhere and I don't exactly know how many will be in there. That's why you're going to want to use count instead of a static number. It's just a better practice. Then you can put a semicolon, and you can put I++, and basically what that does is, so it's going to say I starts at 0, we only read that the first time. After that, we don't care about it. We just know I is equal to 0. Then it's going to ask, is I less than this? Yeah, it is 0. It's going to run all the code in here, and then it's going to add 1 to I. It's going to start over. That's why it's called the loop. Now I will be equal to 1 because we added 1 to it. It's going to do it again. It's still less than that. It's going to run again, and then it's going to add another. Now I is equal to 2, and it's going to keep doing that until it can't do it anymore. For us, that'll be 11. Once it can't do it anymore, it's going to just go on to the rest of the code. But why is this important? Well, it's super important because remember how before I was talking about indexing an array? Here, what we can do is we can say myArray, and then instead of putting, a 0, a 1, a 2, a 3, and keep going, we can just simply put $i. And then if we run this, you'll see we get each number. Better yet, we could concatenate it like we did before. We can add a space. And look at that, we have each number being printed out. This is just a super easy way for us to see everything that's in an array. And also, arrays don't have to be numbers. I'm not sure if I mentioned that. Let's do names, right? So we can make the names Mike, Jake, Cam, Sarah, and Beth. And now, if we do the same thing, but we switch it to names, again, this is a good idea of why you'd want to have functions. We could have a function that would just do this stuff easily, especially if this had more than one line of code in it. And then run that, you'll see all the names are printed out. Now we're going to get into 2 more things, associative arrays and for each loops. So I'm going to comment this out, And back up here at the top, I'm going to declare an associative array. Now, an associative array is very similar to a regular array, but there's one key difference, and that's actually that it has keys. So the way you would type this out is you put your key in. So for me, let's say key 1, and again, this key, like variables, it can be named whatever you want. Then you're going to type an equals and then a greater sign to make an arrow. And you're going to put what that equals. Let's make it 100. Then a comma. Let's make another one. Let's say key 2, 200. And these do not have to equal a number. So I could set this equal to my key, just a regular string. Alright, now let's do this. Let's start out by just var dumping it to give you an idea of what we're working with. And you'll see it's working. We set it up right, which is awesome. Now, if you try here to echo out this at the 0 index, you're going to see something interesting. You get an error, even though you'd think it would work. And the reason is, well, that's the whole point of these keys. It's a different way to access them. So if instead of 0, I give it the string key 1, I get 100. If I want to give it key 3, I should get my key. And that's the beauty of these. And now that you've seen how this works, we're going to get into for each. For each is basically another way to do for loops, but it's a little bit easier and a little bit more dynamic, and you don't have to type out all this code. So most of the time you're going to be doing for each loops. Sometimes you'll need for loops though, that's why I showed them to you, but for each loops is usually where it's at. So you can type for each, and you'll see here it's just parentheses, then you type a variable name. So for us, our variable name is going to be my associative array, and then you're going to put as, and you can leave this as key, and you can leave equal greater than value, or you could type something else if you want, it doesn't matter. And I want to give you an idea of how this works. So if we echo the key here, check out what we get. Oh, let's concatenate a space too. It's a little bit more readable. You'll see we're getting all of the keys here. Key 1, 2, 3. Now, if instead of that, we decided we're going to echo out the value, we get 100, 200, and then my key, because we're grabbing the value from it. And I'll show you something else you can do too. Usually getting this value will be enough, but another way you can do it if you ever have to is you could type in here my associative array, and then you can just pass it the key, which will index it in the same way that we did earlier. Forgot to say echo. And there you go. That is another way to do it. Now we can delete this echo statement. And the next thing I'm going to do is actually delete all of this code here. You can leave it if you want to reference it later, comment it out, or just leave it and start below it. That's totally cool. Now we're going to move on to conditionals. So I'm going to make a variable, and I'm going to call it number, and I'm going to set it equal to 2. Now, the main kind of a conditional is an if statement. So I'm going to type if, parentheses, something is going to go in this parentheses, and then a bracket. The way that this works is essentially this is a test. And if the test is true, then we do everything inside the bracket. If the test is false, we skip the bracket. So to make this simple, we'll say if, and then we'll say number. Now we're going to say here number equals 2. Something I should note is that you never use 1 equal in an if statement. Well, maybe in some programming language, but not in PHP. Or actually any programming languages that I've ever learned. You're going to use 2 or 3. I'll explain the difference in a minute, but we'll start with 2. And I will put if number equals 1, echo true. And then PHP index. You'll see nothing got echoed out. That's because this wasn't true. So now what I'm going to do is introduce you to another one before I keep going with if. This is called else. You can only use an else right after an if statement, right after that closing bracket. To make it even easier, you can put it just like that. That's the only time you're ever going to use an else. Now basically what this says is if this statement's false, we're going to run this. So here we're going to echo false. And we got false. Now that makes sense because number is 2. And here we're saying if number is 1, echo true. It's not true. Else, also known as if not true, is going to be, it's going to run that code and it's going to say false. So if we change this to 2, what should happen, because number is in fact equal to 2, we should be echoing true and not echoing false. This will never run if the if statement runs. And there we go. That's exactly what we wanted to see. Now let's talk about the 3 equals. Well, before that, let's put a quote here. So let's say if number equals quote 2. That's super weird that we got true, isn't it? Because it's a string, it's not even a number. Well, that's what the difference between 2 and 3 equals is. If I run it again, I'll get a false. Wait, 2 equals says if it's the same value, then it's true. 3 equals says if it's the same value and it's the same type, then it's true. 2, the number, and 2, the string, are technically the same value, right? They're both 2. However, one of them is a string and one of them is an integer. So you can use 2 or 3 equal signs. It really depends on what you want to test against. In most cases, you'll be able to get away with 2, but in some where you'd want to test for somebody using a string that has, an integer where you would actually want it to be a number because it could cause problems later in your code, then you would want to use 3. For best practice, you can just always use 3. Now something else you can do is in between this, I can put an else if. Basically what else if says is it says if this, oh, it's not that, before it goes to the else, or even if we don't have an else, it's going to say else if. This is essentially the exact same thing as if I did an if statement, and then another if statement, and then another if statement, and then another if statement. Although the difference here is it's better for when you're testing one case. If we really want to find out what number is, it would be better to put another one of these number equals, and then we could put, 3. The reason that this is better is because then this else at the bottom will catch all of these exceptions. If we just did individual ifs, the else would only run off the very last if statement. So maybe you'll run into a situation where you need to have 10 else if statements. In that case, you would really want to be using else if and not 10 individual ifs, because the else would only catch on the last one. Also, if the if statement comes out true, the other if statements are still going to run. That's not the case here. If this if statement comes out true, this else if statement, it'll never run because it knows that the first one was true. But just to show you how it works, here we could echo else if is true. Now obviously if we run it, we're not going to get that because it's not 3. But if we set it equal to 3, instead of getting true, we'll get else if is true, which is exactly what we wanted. I'm going to get rid of this for the time being. I just wanted to show you that that exists. Hopefully you understand that. Instead, I'm going to show you something else. I'm going to show you some different things that we can do inside of if statements. One thing we can do is we can use operators. So think of it like this. Let's say, maybe we want to say instead of equal, if number is greater than 1. And it is greater than 1. Now we could run if number is less than 1. 3 is of course less than 1. Or sorry, 3 is of course not less than 1. So if we run this, we're going to get false. But you can make it even more complex, right? You could say if number is less than 1 plus 10, which now would be true because that's 11. So let's leave this at less than 1. And now I'm going to show you some logic operators. So one of them is called OR. OR in PHP will look like this in most languages. It's 2 straight lines. Now, what you do here is you put one statement here, and then you put almost a totally different if statement here, right? So let's say is less than 1 or is greater than 10. Basically, the way that this works is you can almost think of it as 2 separate if statements, because if either one of them is true, it'll be true. You'll see here, let's make this 0. Now 0 is less than 1, but it's not bigger than 10. However, if we run it, we get true. And the reason for that is because it sees that this one's true, it doesn't care about this one. And if we did it in the reverse, turned it into an 11, we'd still get true. Because it knows this is false, however, it sees that this is true, so it doesn't care that one of them's false. Now the inverse of this would be the AND statement, which is 2 ampersands. This one has a special requirement. Both have to be true in order for it to be a true if statement. So in order for this code to run, both of the things on each side of the AND have to be true. Now in this case, that's not possible, right? You can't have a number that's less than 1 and is also greater than 10. That just doesn't exist in this world. But what you could do is something like this. You could say if number is greater than 10, let's leave that, and let's change this less than. Let's say number 2 is less than 100. Let's make number 2 equal to 101. This will be true because number 2 is greater than 100 and number 1, or just number, is greater than 10. Oh, sorry, I have to switch that to a greater than sign before I run it. And there we go, we get true. Now, if we flop either one of these, let's say make this less than, we should get false. And the reason for that is even though this number 2 is greater than 100, we see that the other one is false. And for an AND statement, like I said, both have to be true. If either one is false or both are false, it's going to be false. For an OR statement, it's only false when both are false. Alright, now that's going to be it for conditionals. There are other forms of conditionals like ternary statements and switch statements and all kinds of other stuff. But like I said before, I just want to give enough that you can code with it. Those other things are nice and they're fancy and they're a little quicker to use in some cases, but you can get a whole program up and running with just if, else if, and else, and that's the goal here, is to get you to start building some cool stuff. So let's get rid of this. And now we're going to focus on object-oriented programming, or OOP, which is a word you'll hear tossed around a lot in programming. These have 2 things, a class and an object. So the best way to describe this is first with words. So a class is essentially a blueprint of an item, right? Or an object. So let's think of the object here being a car. What would you want in a blueprint of a car? Well, the first thing you'd want is a make and a model, right? So let's say class car, and this is how you start a class. Now let's give it a public variable, and I'll explain what that means in a little bit. Let's give it a public variable of make and a public variable of model. And this will be all we have for our blueprint right now, but we'll come back and add to it. Now for the object, well, we want to make a car, right? So let's say my car as a variable, and let's set it equal to a new car. Now if we var dump this, and you do have to var dump it, you can't just echo it out, and then we run it, you'll see we have an object, which is a car, and we have a make and a model, but they're both null, which makes sense, right? Null is essentially there's nothing there. It's not just empty though, it's null. It's slightly different. And the reason that it's null is because it's never been set equal to anything. Now we could set it equal in the class, but let's set it equal outside of it, just to show you how this is done first. Let's say my car, then let's put a little arrow here. This is different from the associative array arrow. This one uses a dash instead of an equal sign. So we're going to say my car arrow, and then let's say make equals Chevy, and then we can say my car arrow model equals Cobalt. Let's save it, let's run it, and look at that. Now when we dump it, we see exactly what we want. One other thing that I should mention is, let's change this to an echo. If you wanted to get a specific property, we could say this. We could say my car's make equals, so my car arrow make, and then if we echo out this, we'll actually just be getting Chevy, because this is how you access, well, it's one way to access an individual property of a class, and that's just what a variable in a class is. It's a property. There are two things in classes, properties and methods. A method is just a function, but it's a function inside a class, just like how a property is just a variable, but it's a variable inside of a class. It shouldn't be too confusing. Try not to think about it too much. If it is, it'll make sense as you go along and start doing it. So we're going to do our first method here. This is called a construct. Now, there's only one of these inside of any class, and they're not necessary. But I'm going to show you what they can do because they are very helpful. So function underscore underscore construct, and then this is just going to be a regular function, and this does have to be named this. Other methods will not have to be named this. You can name them whatever you want. This one is an exception. It's very special. What makes it so special is you can give it parameters. So I could give it the parameter make and the parameter model. And let's also set a private variable here, and let's call this variable amount of wheels. Right? Because a car is going to have a different amount of wheels. Some cars have 4, some cars have 6, or you know what? Now, leave it. That's just not the best thing. But that is a thing that cars have. Now, inside of this, what we can do is we can say this arrow score make equals $score make, and this arrow score model equals $score model. So this may seem confusing, but whenever you see this, all it's saying is this class, right? So inside of the car class, we have a make and we have a model. So we're saying inside of this car, right? Because eventually it's going to be an object. So not all the cars, but inside, let's say you have 20 different cars that you've made with new car. You've got 20 objects in here. Only the car that is calling this function, this car, is going to have the make that's passed to it in this function. Now, obviously, if I set this to something static, like, 2, they would all have 2, but they would all have 2 individually, right? They'd get them individually. But we're doing this dynamically, and I'll show you a little bit more about that in a second. I'm going to get rid of some of this stuff. I'm going to get rid of everything below the new car, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to pass some variables to it, because that's what a constructor does. It allows you to pass variables, and as soon as you make a new one, it runs it right away, and it takes in the variables you pass. So again, I'm going to pass Chevy, and I'm going to pass Cobalt, and now if we var dump our car, you'll see we get Chevy, we get Cobalt, and we get null for amount of wheels, which is fine. We haven't set that. One other thing that I want to show you is what's going to happen if we try to set a private variable. So I'm going to say my car, and then in the same way we did it before, an arrow, and then amount of wheels equals 2. Run it, and you'll see that amount of wheels, car, private, it still equals null. We have a new variable here, a blank one, that equals 2, which is just a bit of a mistake, but that's just because it can't access this, which I'll explain in a minute. But before I do that, let's change this to protected. Now it's a protected variable. Do it again. Same thing, still null. All right, lastly, let's change this to static. Do it again. And now you'll see that it isn't even there. Isn't that weird? So the key difference here is the scope. Public, it makes sense, right? It's public. So it can be accessed pretty much anywhere. Now, of course, you still need an object, but you can access it anywhere inside the class and anywhere, you're using the object. Private has a different scope. Private can only be accessed inside of the class. You can still change private variables, but in order to do that, you have to use what's known as a getter or a setter function, where I could write a function here. Let's change this to private. And I could say set amount of wheels. Let's make this a public function. Okay, set amount of wheels. And this is going to take in an amount. Inside of this function, we can say this amount of wheels equals amount. All right. Now, instead of saying this right here, what we can say is my car, arrow, call the function, set amount of wheels, and pass 4. Run it. And there you go. Now this private variable has an integer of 4, which is what we want. And in most cases, when you're designing your code for your projects, you're probably not going to use private, and you're probably not going to use protected. You'll probably just use public. But if you ever decide to get a job using object-oriented programming, they will be using these. So it's a good idea to just learn them, or at least have a basic idea of what they do. Oh, and of course protected. I forgot about that. Protected is kind of in between public and private. You can't access it in the object, but you can access it in the class, and you can also access it in a class that extends this class, which is not something I'm going to be getting into in this video. It's a little more advanced, but I could potentially make another class which extends upon this class without, copying and pasting everything in this class. A private variable will still not be able to be changed inside of the extended class, but a protected one will. So just know, either way, you cannot access them in the object. You would need to use something like this, which is a better programming practice, but it is not necessary. You can just use public, and as a beginner, if you're watching this tutorial, you're probably a beginner, just use public and start out like that. All right, next up is static. Now let's make a new static variable. So let's say public static, and let's call this dealer. Let's imagine that we want all these classes to have the same dealer. Inside of the construct, what we could say is : dealer, and we could set that equal to, I guess Chevy would also be the dealer, right? I think they're a car dealer. And now let's just run it again. All right, so you'll see it's not showing up, right? And that's because it's not a normal property. But you can make it show up and you can use it. So inside of my car, we could say : and then dealer, run this, and you'll get Chevy. You can make static functions as well, and it's the same concept. So the main difference here is that if I wanted to, I could comment this out, and I could use it without getting an instance of the class or an object, right? And what I could do is literally just say car, which is the class name, : dealer. I could run that. Oh, that gave me null because I never actually defined it, because I never called a constructor, which is totally fine. So I can comment this out. Dealer equals Chevy up there. Run it, and now we get Chevy, which is exactly what we want. Again, the constructor only gets called when it's made into an object. So since it was never made into an object, that was never called, which is why we got null. If you try to access a property, you'll get something worse than null. So you'll see here we have car, and we're going to try to access, let's go with make. It's all red because it's going to give me an error, and the code will shut down because it's not possible to access a property. And that's why you might want to use static instead of a regular not static property in some instances. The most common way to do that would be in making a static method or a static function, right? Because it's no longer a method of the object, it's just a function. You could then just, let's say we had a function called make, you would be able to call make. I mean, we don't, but if we did, and it was static, we would just be able to call it without needing to create a whole object. So if your class has a function where you'd want to call it without an object, that's when you would want to use static. Same with a variable. Maybe there's something specific you want to store, right? Maybe each time you make a new model, you're adding one to a dealership value of cars sold, right? So in that case, you would want to be able to make that static, so that way you could just grab the amount of cars sold without getting the dealer class. That's one use case that might be helpful. There's a whole bunch of them, but it's never necessary. You never need it, so I wouldn't worry about it too much if you can't think of a good use case when you're writing your own program. And that is the basics of object-oriented programming. This is actually a really complicated topic, so if it doesn't make sense completely, that's okay. I'm going to continue with it in the next tutorials, and I'm going to continue to try to explain it better, and I'm going to be using it while explaining it in my projects. I understand that this is a difficult concept to grasp, and if you don't fully get it, that's totally fine. Just focus on the stuff besides this that you should be able to understand. This is complex. That is the end of this tutorial too. Hopefully you found this helpful. If you did, let me know. Leave a like or something. That'd be cool. I'm going to be making 2 more of these, and like I said before, I'm going to be making a few projects. The first one should already be out when you watch this. It's just a simple password generator. Be a good thing to go to right after this tutorial and try and build it with me and make sure that you've got a good understanding of how this stuff is working. And then 2 more tutorials, and I will be posting a video on how to make a crypto bot, and I will also be posting a video on how to build a backend API. So hopefully if you enjoyed this, you subscribe and you watch those as well. Have a great day. Take it easy.